Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to what's today? Welcome to Thursday. So I have a little bit of a different thing for you here today because um, this is something that I always mean to kind of fit into kind of global history somewhere, but I always kind of I never get around to finding a place to put it, and then by the time we get to the end of the course, I don't have time for it anymore, and I never do it. So, seeing as we do have some time, I am going to do it. And so, what I'd like to talk about is the sort of situation or conflict or history of what's going on between Palestine and Israel. And so, if you're paying or if you were paying any attention to the news this year, you'll know that again, Palestine and Israel, or the Palestinians and the Israelis, were having some conflicts earlier in the year. Rockets were fired back and forth, people died, and then there was a ceasefire. And so this thing has been going on for decades now. And again, it's worth looking at because, of course, even though it's a modern conflict, right, we're still having things happen in the 21st century here. It's very much rooted in what happens in the 20th century. So Palestine and Israel, or the Palestinians and the Israelis, are fighting now because of what happened in the 20th century. Okay, so this is kind of the area of the world that we're talking about here, and so this might not be the best map, but I'll show you another one. And so you can see there Israel and Palestine right on the border of the Mediterranean, just above Egypt and just kind of south of Syria and Lebanon and all those places. And this is kind of the area we're looking at here. And so Palestine is kind of the traditional name of this territory. And so most of this is now the state of Israel, but historically speaking, it was called Palestine. And if you know anything about the Bible, you might recognize some of these places: the Dead Sea and Jerusalem and the Jordan River. All of those are kind of biblical landmarks, right? They appear in the Bible. You'll see there Philistia and Phoenicia. Those, I think, are Greek names for those areas. But those people will show up in ancient history as well. And in the Bible, the Phoenicians and the Philistines are spoken about in the Bible. So this area of the world has, of course, a very long history going back thousands of years. But the current conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis is not quite so old. It's a lot younger than that. So again, this kind of historical region of Palestine has been controlled by various groups for the past 200 years. And so, we won't go through 2,000 years of history because that's way too much. But coming into the 20th century here, we see that the region is under the control of the Ottoman Turks. So it's part of the Ottoman Empire. And you'll remember the Ottoman Empire as being part of World War I. But in the process of World War I happening, the empire kind of falls apart, and the Allied powers like the British and the French, they kind of get in there and divide up what was left of the Ottoman Empire, right? Turkey, of course, will come out of there as well. So once the Ottoman Empire kind of comes apart, countries like Britain and France feel that this area of the world, the Middle East, is theirs for the taking. And then again, they start kind of carving up this area into protectorates that they can have under their control, okay? Again, the British were awarded a mandate for this region in 1922. So after World War I was over, some countries were labeled protectorates or mandates, right? And so the job, of course, was for Britain to kind of create a government in Palestine and eventually allow them to be independent, right? That was the plan anyway. Of course, the Palestinians weren't entirely happy with British rule, and you can see they revolted a number of times against British control. After World War I, we see that a lot of European Jewish people start to immigrate to Palestine. And so they have the support here. They're kind of war refugees. They have the support of the League of Nations and the British government. And they are, good morning. And there's, the beginnings of conflict for land, right? So we have these Jewish people leaving Europe after World War I, arriving in Palestine, and trying to find places to live, right? And again, they're going to come into conflict with Palestinians at this point. Now, this is kind of the crux of the matter. This is the kind of focus of the problem that we have between the Palestinians and the Israelis right now. And so some people are tempted to think, oh, this is a religious war, right? Because we have Palestinian Muslims and we have Jewish Israelis, right? Kind of fighting each other. But it's not really a religious war. It's not really about religion. What it is, it's about land, right? And so going into the Second World War, we find that, again, Palestine is under the control of the British. And the British make the Palestinians, who are Arabs, they make the Palestinians a deal, right? And they say, hey, if you cooperate, if you fight with us, if you support us during the war, we will work to create a Palestinian state, right? A place that is, yours, your own country. We'll get out and you can have a Palestinian Arab state right here in your homeland, right? That was the deal, right? And so, of course, the Palestinians did assist the British in World War II, but at the end of World War II, clearly you will remember that the horrors of the Holocaust appear, right? So the Allied soldiers move into Germany and to Eastern Europe. They liberate those countries and encounter these death camps that the Nazis have set up. And they see the kind of horrible things that have been happening to Jewish people, but also others in these camps, right? And so the United Nations, in the process of, or in the aftermath of World War II, and in the process of trying to create, a definition of genocide, which we said they did, right? The Genocide Convention laid out what that crime was. They also adopt a partition plan for Palestine. And so the idea comes about that the Jewish people need their own state, right? Clearly they're persecuted. There's a lot of prejudice against Jewish people. Hitler just tried to exterminate them and killed 5 to 7 million of them. The Jewish people need their own state where they will be safe, right? And so the place that they, of course, choose is the Jewish homeland, which is also Palestine, right? So the Palestinians' home is Palestine, but the Jewish people's home is Palestine as well. And so the United Nations suggests that, okay, we're going to take this land, we're going to kind of cut it up, right? And we're going to have a Palestinian part and a Israeli part, or a Jewish part, right? And both of these groups can have a home state. The city of Jerusalem, which is very important to Islam and to Christianity, will be kind of an international city, and that's what we'll do, right? But early on, neither side is really happy, right? And so the Palestinians are kind of like, well, hey, you promised us a state, and now you're talking about moving all of these Jewish people in. What the heck, right? I thought we were going to get our own state. That was the deal, right? That was the promise. And again, all during this period, more and more Jewish refugees from Europe are entering Palestine and trying to find places to live. And so the Palestinians kind of reject this idea. They go back to the British and to the United Nations and say, hey, we had a deal, and now you're Now you're backing out, right?
Is it what like Palestinians like these days? Is it well like they kind of blame the U.S.
Do they kind of blame the U.S.?
Like they kind of blame the U.S. but like, is it right?
Well, we'll get to that a little later, but maybe just, we can jump ahead. The U.S. has been, from the beginning, has been a very heavy supporter of Israel, right? They were part of the United Nations. They supported the idea that that Jewish people should have a home state, right, where they will be safe and they can govern themselves. But also for the U.S., Israel is very strategically located, right? And so I'm just going to back up a little bit. So lots of Western powers, Britain, France, and later the U.S., they all have interests in the Middle East, right? And some of it has to do with oil, because we know a lot of oil comes from the Middle East. Some of it has to do with trade routes, right? And so if you know anything about this part of the world, you know that the British built the Suez Canal, right? And so that little finger of water that you see right by Cairo, the British built a canal to connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean Sea. And so they were able to ship all sorts of goods right through there instead of going all the way down around the south part of Africa. And so Western powers had a lot of interests in this part of the world, politically, economically, and so for the Americans, they felt that that Israel would be a great strategic kind of place to have military bases, right? Because again, they have a lot of the Americans have a lot of interest in this part of the world, particularly economically, but they don't have a lot of friends in this part of the world, right? Saudi Arabia is not necessarily the friend of the Americans, nor is Iran, nor is Iraq, right? Nor is Syria. Turkey depends, not right now, not with Erdogan in there. And so this is kind of an area of the world that America has a lot of interest in, but not a lot of friends, right? And so for the Americans, it was very useful to have a friend in Israel so that they could maintain a military presence in the Middle East. And so the sort of blame toward the Americans is justified because the Americans have supported Israel politically and economically for quite a while. And in part, they've done it because it works for them, right? They get to have military bases right in the Middle East where they, again, don't have many friends. The other part of it, which we don't have to go into, is that there's lots of evangelical Christians in the U.S., and evangelical Christians have this belief that, before the great judgment, before God comes to earth and, judges everyone and takes them to heaven and all that stuff, before that has to happen, the Jews are prophesied to return to Israel. And so evangelical Christians are kind of in favor of Israel and of Jewish people going to Israel because that's part of their belief system, right? Once that happens, then, all these other, religious events can happen as well, if you believe that sort of thing, right? Does that answer your question, Andre? Yeah. So, let's see. Oh, yeah. So, Israel is created, right? In 1946, they declare that they are an independent state, right? And so the UN is trying to sort of create some sort of plan to divide up Palestine between the Palestinians and the Israelis. In the process of that, Israel declares that they self-declare that they are a state, okay? Now, hang on. Where are we here? Okay, this is where we have to do a little bit of reading because we have to catch up on what happens, right? So again, the UN is planning to divide up Palestine between the Palestinian, who are Arabs and Muslims, and the Jewish people, who are Jewish people and Jewish. They're gonna, well, it's an ethnicity and a religion, right? It's both. So what I would like to do is just read these few pages just so we can catch up on what happens after the partition plan and kind of bring us up to closer to modern day. After that, I do have a little documentary to show you, and it's kind of interesting because it's not a typical history documentary. It's more about the experience of living in Israel today. Okay, and it's kind of focused on, I think, 3 or 4 specific individuals. So it's not really a history documentary in the way that we're used to seeing it. But again, being able to read this and understand what's going on will inform that documentary, okay? So let me give you some time to read here. I'm gonna put some time on the clock, about 15 minutes, and I'll check in with you. I'll check in with you after that, and maybe we can answer some questions and then proceed with the documentary, if that's okay. We are done. We are done.
So there's no one there?
What's that?
No one?
Nope. What's that?
I think there were more.
No, they're not presenting because they missed their opportunity. Yeah.
Okay, so the homework you just submitted. But the
Oh, yes.
One question, so you can just submit.
Yes, the part 3 thing you can send in.
So
Yeah.
that is more where
Correct.
okay, got it.
Correct. Or even if you don't submit it, like, it's there, so I'm going to go and look through it anyway. So whether you submit or not, I'll look at it. Okay, let's read, and then we will talk. And of course, this is in Microsoft Teams. If you don't have the book.
So one more question.
Yeah.
So that you need to like one questions on that.
No, you don't. Okay. Just another minute or two, and then we'll talk about this, okay? Okay, so again, this is a complicated history, right? There's a lot of things going on here, but that's good to realize, right? Because I think, what we're currently seeing in the media today is, when something like this happens, it's like pick a side, right? Who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, right? And if you pick the wrong side or support the wrong people, then you're evil, right? And well, you don't have to choose to be neutral either, but I would suspect that most of the people who are online, talking about what's happening with Israel or Palestine, I would suggest that most people don't really know the history of what we just read, right? And again, it's important to, if you're going to have an opinion, make sure it's an informed one, right? And
I had a weird experience a couple of weeks back.
okay.
I was out and I was talking to this girl, and she asked me, I support like the Palestinian movement and stuff,
Mhm.
and then I told her I don't know anything about it, but I just know like there's this war going on, like I don't really have an opinion,
Yeah.
and she got pissed off with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to have an opinion, right?
Yeah, but I don't know too much to be able to form an opinion at all. And I tried explaining it to her, but
Yeah.
she wasn't having it.
No. What kind of things was she saying?
Honestly, I don't remember because once she started getting heated, I kind of just shut her brain off.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. And often that's how it goes, right? Is that people, it becomes kind of
Controversial topic.
well, yeah, but it also becomes like a sort of a tribal issue, right? Are you on my team or not? Right? Whose side are you on? And I would bet money that she would want you to be on the side of the Palestinians. Yeah. So, and it's true, right? That currently there's a big power differential, right? Israel is the more powerful state. They have more weaponry. Palestinians are kind of, under occupation, and they don't have the resources that Israel does. And so there is a pretty big difference in terms of who has power and who doesn't here. But again, it's a much more complicated situation. So very quickly, what is this Zionist movement about? What does that mean?
It's like they don't want the Palestinians. Oh, they want Israel to be like the same emperor, but there's some parts are not like.
Well, the Zionists originally were people who wanted the state of Israel to exist, right? They were fighting in order to gain a country for Jewish people themselves, right? Those are who Zionists actually were. And again, that was a useful cause decades ago because again, Israel didn't really exist, right? The text went on to talk about the Balfour Declaration, which said a number of things. And in fact, the Balfour Declaration is important for Canada too, because it was kind of the first step in the British government saying, all of you colonies that are under the control of Britain, well, you can start to make decisions on your own, right? You can start to make rules and laws that maybe don't perfectly align with those of the British Parliament, right? And so it was kind of a first step towards Britain kind of giving up its empire, right, very slowly. But as you can see, the Balfour Declaration supports the Zionists, right? It supports the idea of an independent state for Jewish people, but it also says that, oh, but the Palestinians should not be imposed upon either, which of course the book points out is contradictory, right? You can't say that, we're going to move a bunch of Israeli people into your territory, but somehow you won't be affected in any way, right? You can't promise both of those things. They negate each other. So we see that the UN comes up with a partition plan, right, to divide Palestine and Israel. Again, nobody really likes it. The Palestinians think it's crap because this isn't what they were promised, right? They were promised a Palestinian state. The Israelis don't like it either because it doesn't allow them security, right? And as you can read here, keep in mind, and I'm not taking sides here one way or the other, but the Israelis are surrounded by people who are unfriendly to them, right? The Arabs are kind of somewhat allied, right, around them, and the Israelis are kind of surrounded by their enemies. So they're very concerned about their security, and they don't like that partition plan either. And so once the state of Israel is created and the UN says, okay, job well done, we'll see you, let us know how it turns out, good luck, right? Almost immediately they go to war, right, in 1948. And so what's kind of the result of that 1948 Arab-Israeli war?
Increase the animosity between the two people.
Mm-hmm.
And there was even more resentment than before.
Right. So, as you might expect, a war doesn't exactly make people all snuggly and cozy toward each other. In fact, it makes people more upset. And what about the territory of Israel?
Split up.
Well, it already is split up, but it expands, right? Yeah. So the Israelis managed to take more land than originally they had been given by the UN, right? So the UN said, okay, we're going to cut it up. Here's Palestine, here's Israel. Israel says, we don't like that. We're going to go to war and we're going to take what we want, right? And so, yeah, there's a conflict and Israel is able to take over more territory, right? We hear a little bit about Nasser, right? And so Nasser overthrows, is it King Farouk? Was that his name? Yeah. Farouk, if I remember, is a puppet of the British, right? So the British tell him what to do and he does it, right? And Nasser is I think he's ex-military, and he decides to, overthrow the state, kicks out Farouk, takes control of Egypt, and, starts to nationalize it, right? And so he's trying to kick the colonial powers out, right? And he does it with the Suez Canal, right? The British build that canal to connect the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, and Nasser says, yep, that's in our territory, that's ours now, right? And that doesn't go very well, of course, right? Because the British and the French and the Israelis, they kind of hatch a plan, right? What's their plan? Is that the Suez Crisis, right?
Egypt, right?
Is that what they call it?
Suez Crisis,
Yeah.
yeah.
So the Suez Crisis, what happens?
They bomb Egypt. Basically.
Yeah, what's the secret plan, though, between Britain, France, and Israel? It's sneaky. It's a sneaky plan.
The British and the French would pretend to intervene.
Mm.
They would intervene under the guy, under disguise.
Yeah.
They want the restoring order with like amended terms.
Sneaky, right? So they say to Israel, they're like, hey, Israel, you attack Egypt, and then once you do, we'll rush in and say, oh no, don't fight, you guys, calm down. And then in the process, we'll take back the Suez Canal, right? Because they're trying to, stop the violence, right? And so, yeah, sneaky plan, right? The Americans don't know anything about this, right? So the Americans go to the UN and say, hey, something's happening in the Middle East, we need to stop it. And so a UN peacekeeping force comes in, separates the Israelis and the Egyptians, sends the British and French home, right? And basically occupies the Suez Canal. So it doesn't work. It's very embarrassing, right, for this sneaky little pact that they had.
And no one got it again.
And nobody what?
Nobody got the Suez Canal.
Nobody got the Suez Canal. Now it belongs to Egypt now, but. And interestingly, if you're curious, that's actually where the Canadian flag comes from.
Huh?
Well, because prior to, let me just show you here. Actually, this is an interesting story. Although oh yeah, okay. How do I move this back? There we go.
They missed the view of this
It was today. Not against my main times. And then like.
Okay, there it is. There it is. So, when the Suez Crisis happened, there we go. When the Suez Crisis happened, again, the UN sent in peacekeepers, right, to sort of cool things down. And this was actually, that was the Canadian flag at the time. And so this is the one that we had, prior to, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And so there were Canadian peacekeepers in the Suez trying to keep the peace. And for the Egyptians looked at the Canadians' uniforms, right, because they had their flag on the shoulder or whatever, and they're like, hey, what the heck? Like, the British were the ones who attacked us, and now here, these are the peacekeepers, but they're wearing part of the British flag on their uniform? What's this about? I thought you guys are supposed to be neutral, right? And here, one of the attackers is, their flag is being shown. And so that kind of convinced the Canadian government that, maybe it's time for our own flag, right? And so there was an initial design of this. No kidding, right? Everyone who looks at this flag is like, ugh, right? What is that thing? So the first draft looked like that. Nobody liked it, except for, I forget if it was Lester B. Pearson, our prime minister. He liked it, but nobody else liked it. And then finally they settled on, of course, the one that we know and love, which is much cleaner, much better, and very distinctive, right? It doesn't look like any other. It doesn't look like any other flag, right? There's lots of flags that have like 3 colors, right, or 3 colors or something like that.
Yeah, it's like someone who's colorblind.
No kidding, right?
Yeah.
That's actually a good point. But this one, even if you are colorblind, it's pretty clear what it is, right?
Friend.
What's that?
I have a colorblind friend. Can't tell the difference between the French flag and the Italian flag.
Yeah. Is it probably red-green colorblind? Like, doesn't see red and green? Yeah. Yeah, so interestingly, the Suez Crisis is one of the things that influences the flag that Canada has. Whoops, the flag that Canada has today kind of comes out of Suez. But anyway, that's an aside. So we see a few more attacks, right, that happen. We don't need to go into detail with Yom Kippur War and 6 Days War, and we don't need to sort of figure out all the details, but kind of suffice it to say, what's the general picture of the Middle East and Palestine and Israel and the U.S. and France and Britain? How would you describe this situation?
Ethnic discrimination.
Ethnic discrimination? Okay, what else? It's kind of the remnants of colonialism, right? As Britain and France continue to want to sort of control areas of the world, right, that don't want to be controlled by them. But then all of these countries have economic interests, right? Because there's so much oil in the Middle East, everybody wants to make sure that they have steady access to that oil, right? While at the same time, these sides want to get at each other and either fight or, gain more territory for Israel or kick the Israelis out.
Is it still for economic gain? Or just territorial gain?
For whom?
For Israel, right now.
Well, let me show you some.
Is this it's still the same reason?
Well, let me just see. Where's my map here? Yeah, so you can sort of see this happening over the decades, right? Where not only did the power has shifted, right, from an area that was mostly Palestinian Arabs, and then over time seeing more Jewish immigrants come in, then seeing the Americans dump a lot of money and military technology into Israel itself, and the power balance has significantly shifted. And so here you can see in the second from the left, that was the partition plan, right? That was what the UN suggested, right? Palestine in green, Israel in yellow, right? And it kind of had to do a little bit with where the Jewish people had already settled in Palestine, right? So we had a bunch of Jewish immigrants coming in, and the UN basically said, okay, well, we're just going to draw some lines around you, and you can have that, and the Palestinians can have this, right? But again, the Palestinians lose a lot of land in that deal, and again, they were promised the whole thing, right? They were promised they would have their own state. For the Israelis, they look at that and they're like, no, that's not secure. We're all separated. We're stuck against the sea. Like, how are we supposed to defend ourselves if the Arabs attack us, right? And so you can see in the 1967 war, you can see that Israel tries to connect, right? It takes over larger pieces of land. It connects those three separate pieces so that it's more secure, and it winds up pushing the Palestinians onto the West Bank, and they call it that because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River, into the West Bank and into Gaza, right? And so we see the Palestinians are kind of pushed there. There's refugee camps set up, and since then, that's kind of where the Palestinians have been confined to, right? And so the state of Israel has kind of set its boundaries. They push the Palestinians into these two areas. But what's happened since then is that it's very slow, maybe not very slowly, but sort of consistently, more and more Jewish people have, been born or have immigrated to Israel. And they're starting to settle in places that the Palestinians used to live. So you can see there, the West Bank in 1967 was mostly Palestinian, but Jewish people are starting to move into those areas, right? Developers are coming in and building neighborhoods and houses and streets, and those houses are getting sold to Israelis, right? And Israelis are kind of pushing them out, not militarily, but kind of economically and socially, right? These neighborhoods are being constructed, sold to Jewish people. Jewish people are moving into these areas that the Palestinians used to live in. And of course, the Israeli military is there to make sure that there's no trouble in the process. And so as time goes on, the Palestinians are getting pushed further and further out, or further and further away, where there's really nowhere for them to go. And as you can see, Israel is seemingly intent on absorbing all of the territory. And the question, of course, is going to be, where are these Palestinians going to go, right? They're not really full citizens of the state of Israel, so what's going to happen to them, right? So yeah, you can see that where we are right now, Israel is definitely the military power in the area, right? They've been supported by the US and have US military technology, so they are super strong. They have nuclear weapons, for crying out loud. But the Palestinians are increasingly getting pushed into smaller and smaller areas. They don't have money, they don't have resources. They are supported by some parts of the Arab world, but they're kind of under threat, right? And the more they become under threat, the more terrorist organizations can convince people that, that they need to fight, right? And so you read about the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They were around since, I think, the 1960s, but recently they're being kind of pushed aside because people think the PLO isn't doing anything. And so more extreme groups like Hamas are stepping forward and saying, the PLO isn't doing it, right? Israel is, pushing into our territory, discriminating against our people, and we're going to solve this in a more violent fashion, right? And so you can see Hamas is, obtaining rockets, firing them into Israel, and then of course Israel responds by firing back. Right? But unfortunately for Palestine, the Israeli rockets are much better than the Palestinian rockets. And so a lot more Palestinians die in these conflicts because their weaponry isn't as good, and they definitely don't have technology to repel the missiles, which the Israelis do have. They have something called Sky Shield, which I think uses, I forget the technology it uses, but it's used to shoot down incoming missiles. And so, yeah, the Israelis have the technology to defend themselves. The Palestinians, not so much. So yeah, this, we see that from about 1946 to, I guess, to the 1960s, we see wars happening back and forth. The sort of end result of that is that Israel gains more territory. They gain more and more US support. And then since that time, the Palestinians have kind of slowly been pushed out, right? And again, a lot of it has to do with building and, zoning and, new neighborhoods being created. And yeah, it's sort of pushing the Palestinians out of whatever was left of their homeland, right? And again, we haven't seen any real peace settlement since that time. And again, but sometimes we see flare-ups of violence like we saw a month ago or maybe 2 months ago with Hamas launching rockets from the Gaza Strip there, where you can see, and of course Israel returning fire, right? And yeah. Okay, so I think that's just the bare bones of background that we need here. Can we take a short break, and then when you come back, I'll show you some video?
Yeah.
Okay, let's take 10, and then when you come back, we'll try to sort of get a ground view look at what's going on in Israel and Palestine. Okay, people, and we're back. So, sorry, I'm just gonna get something set up here. Sorry everyone, I just need to drag something in here and then we'll be good. Good. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to show you a short documentary here that talks about the situation in Palestine and Israel now. And so, again, we don't have a ton of time to deal with this, but suffice it to say, it's a conflict that goes back decades. It doesn't really have to do with religion. Indeed, the two groups are from different ethnic groups and different religions, right? We have Arab Muslims and we have Jewish Jews. We have, never works. We have these two groups that are ethnically and religiously different, but that's not really what they're fighting about. They're really fighting about land. And in fact, Palestine has been called the twice promised land, right? It was promised to the Palestinians, and then later it was promised to the Jews, right? And so we have, the Israelis that want their state, and we have the Palestinians that want their state, but unfortunately those states are wanting to take up the same piece of land, and that's just not physically possible, right? And so there's been lots of attempts to talk peace. There have been wars and then ceasefires. There have been little flare-ups of violence like we've seen in the past few weeks. But also we see this gradual process of the Palestinians being pushed out of their territory by the settlement of Jewish people, right? And again, really with no end in sight. And for a while, people were hopeful for a two-state solution, right? So some sort of way in which we could have both states existing at the same time. But as you can see from that map on the far right, it doesn't so much look like that's going to happen, right? It looks like eventually Israel will simply absorb all the Palestinian territory, and then what becomes of the Palestinians is a big question mark, okay? But let's watch this documentary and see what things are happening on the ground, okay? So I hope this is a good one. I haven't actually used this documentary before, so I hope it works. Online people, there's a link for you in Microsoft Teams, so I'll let you go there. Let's watch about 20 minutes of this and just see how it goes and see what we see, okay? So online people, will see you in about 20 minutes back here, and we'll watch the first 20 minutes here in class. So see you in a bit. Okay, so I think that's kind of interesting to see what's going on, right? Because again, it really grounds it, and you know, we can see how people are kind of living their lives, right? And how some of these places look, and how some people are suffering, and then like our friend Abdel Nasser, he's not really suffering at all, right? He comes from a pretty wealthy family, and you know, that'll be our last day, right? So, okay, so that's all. I'll see you all tomorrow. This is kind of interesting. It looks like I have one of those fake backgrounds behind me,
Oh yeah,
right? But it's actually that is really what it looks like out the window. It's not some sort of fakery, but